and welcome to the West Cork History Festival 2021, which is entirely digital this year. We are delighted to have Robert Harris speaking to us today. And one of the themes of this year's festival is Ireland and Empire. And Robert has chosen a fascinating topic, which is the connections between West Cork and the Anglo-Zulu wars in the 19th century. Just to do a brief introduction, Robert's a retired architect. He lives overlooking Rosbryn Cove, so very local. And along with his partner Finola, he writes the Roaringwater Journal blog, which covers the most amazing range of archaeology, history, natural history, and I highly recommend it to anyone who doesn't necessarily subscribe to it, the Roaringwater Journal. Anyway, a few years ago, Robert was asked by Maura Cahallan, who at the time was the editor of the Skibbereen Historical Journal, to do some work on the connections between Cork, West Cork specifically, and the Zulu Wars. And this is the talk that came out of it. And he's going to now share his presentation on that with us. Over to you, Robert.
Hello, everybody. It's good that you've all tuned in. I want to tell you a bit about the associations of West Cork individuals with the Anglo-Zulu Wars, as Victoria said just now. And I had to do this research when I was asked by Maura Cahallan of the Skibbereen Historical Society to actually formulate a talk for them on the subject. So this is virtually that same talk with a few tweaks. So the Zulu Wars, as I call them, the Zulu Wars, took place in the late 19th century in Africa, obviously. And so there are some surprising links, really, between people of West Cork and those wars. And I'm going to try and illustrate that in this talk. And particularly, I want to show you quite a lot of artists' impressions. So let's go. A gripping tale of empire, adventure, art, and arrogance. There are the Zulu Wars, West Cork and the Zulu Wars. And that's me, with a cast of thousands. There's some of them, and there's some more. So if I was giving this talk live, which I normally would, I would ask the audience if they knew where is this? Does anyone in the audience know where this is? Well, I know you can't answer me, so I'll have to tell you. It's Magdalen College, Oxford. And in the year 1875, we find this character, the leading actor in our drama. So he's one of our heroes. And there he is, having a good time by the looks of it. Also looks as though he plays a concertina, which I do too. So yeah, I feel a bit of a close relationship with this man. There he is, William Whitelock Lloyd, born in Strancally Castle, Waterford. And he was at Magdalen College together with this other fellow. And they were good friends and got up to a few escapades. Now, William's ancestors, or some of them, were connected with the gunpowder plot, and which you all know about, of course, the attempt to blow up the Houses of Parliament. And perhaps for that reason that William got himself into this situation. In other words, he was thrown out of residence on Monday the 15th because he'd been very negligent in attendance at lectures for some time and was concerned in a disturbance in college on the night of the 5th of this month. That was the 5th of November, which, as you know, is the date that the gunpowder plot is celebrated. So 5th of November 1875, unfortunately, William's head had to roll in the same way that his ancestors' heads rolled back in the day there. So here's the picture of him, the full picture of him, which he drew himself. So you can see, a pretty good artist, actually. And you'll see that because we're going to use a lot of his work as we go through this. So that's Strancally Castle, just to let you know where he was brought up. And while he was there, as every young man did, you had to have something to do in your spare time. So he joined the Carlow Rifles. So I had to go and look up what I could find out about the Carlow Rifles. And I even found an old photograph of them, back in a 19th century photograph of members of the Carlow Rifles. And also this dinner menu. So they obviously enjoyed themselves. So this is 1855. They all had a dinner together in Kilkenny Castle. Well, we are talking about West Cork, aren't we? So why am I talking about William, who actually came from Waterford? Now, some of you West Cork residents will recognize this place. It's actually Glandore, and that house there is called Westview House. It's one of the fine houses that looks over the water at Glandore. There it is. It's still a fine house today. In William's day, it was equally fine, and he had this same view looking out across the water. So this was his residence. This is where he lived for all his married life. Now, as a young man, he failed at Oxford. He got thrown out. So what did he do? He went and joined the army, the British Army, and he joined the 24th Regiment of Foot, which was a British regiment, an English regiment at the time, but it actually became the South Wales Borderers in 1881. So after the period we're talking about. So when he joined, it was the 24th Regiment of Foot. But I think he joined because his name Lloyd obviously has Welsh connections, and this particular regiment had also a Welsh background. Now, at the time, this was the way the map looked. All the red pieces, of course, are the British Empire, as it was then. And if you look down in the south of Africa, there's a lot of red around there. In fact, there's a whole red band going all the way up through Africa, up towards Egypt. But there's a few gaps on the right-hand side. And why was the British Empire interested in Africa? Well, this is one reason. And this is another. Of course, they weren't the only reasons, but anyway, let's go on and look at this man. He's actually the villain of our piece, Sir Henry BARTLE-FRERE. So in the late 19th century, he was the High Commissioner in Africa, and he had great ideas for the way he wanted to see Africa develop. And he was really keen on getting a federation of states all under the British Empire in Southern Africa. Now, I showed you Frere as he liked to see himself on the left there. The way the newspapers and the caricatures saw him is portrayed on the right. So that's interesting, isn't it? Anyway, let's move on to Army Headquarters at Aldershot and have a look at this photo, which I was very pleased to find. Right in the middle there is our man, William Whitelock Lloyd, after he joined up. And obviously the group here is on some sort of signaling exercise, because you can see the Alders lamp, you can see semaphore flags, and you can see a little boy over on the far left having a look to see what's going on. Anyway, there's Lloyd in his early days in the army. And he joined in 1879, which was just the right time to join if you were interested in going off to Africa, because the whole force was sent across to Africa. And wherever William went, he produced drawings and sketches. And he had a great sense of humor, as I think you can see from this first example. So it's headed ordered on active service. So they knew they were all going to go off to Africa. And he's comparing Tompkins on the left, wondering how he is going to get all his baggage down to 40 pounds, which is obviously a bit like today on Ryanair, which is obviously the limit. While Smith, over on the right, whose furniture consists of a coal box, a bed and a table, could start in half an hour. I think possibly our friend William associated himself with the man on the right. And here's another of his sketches, which he heads officers' mess and quarters in East London. And of course, it's just a railway carriage. They're being transported. So obviously, there's a lot of waiting around, so they sit around and play cards or whatever. But it's a great, I think, it's a great portrayal of life. And as we go through this presentation, you'll see a lot of his drawings that he made at the time. So they were bound for Africa on the RMS Balmoral, and here it is, leaving in 1879. And while on board, of course, he recorded things, as he always did. He always had his sketchbook in his hand. And I think they're really rather nice, these portrayals. It really sort of brings to life, perhaps even better than photographs, really, these sketches. But anyway, let's carry on. So here he is now going down, and he's obviously got to go around the Cape of Good Hope. So there's his view of the Cape of Good Hope lighthouse. Now, here we are in South Africa, and have a look at that. This is actually a map in 1885, and we're talking a bit earlier than that. We're talking about 1879. But you can see all the pink territories there, which are obviously all British. And right over on the right, there's a little one, which is Zululand. And that's where they were heading. And they landed here in Durban. Now, it took 5 weeks to get from London to Durban. So they had the voyage. And then once they were in Durban, they had to march to where they were headquartered in Natal on the border with Zululand. And so this is the point they were aiming for. And that involved going across country. And of course, William, as always, recorded everything. So here's his view of Zululand. After they landed, they were looking across the river. So there was a border between Natal and Zululand, which consisted of the rivers, the Buffalo River and the COGHILL River. And here's a photograph of the same area. And that's William's drawing of the same place. An interesting sketch, because it looks like the sea or all the mountains behind. But in fact, if you look at the photograph, he's looking right across the plains of Africa there. And always there's little figures in his drawings. You can see some little houses, and you can see quite a lot of groups of people there. A typical view we might have seen as they were being transported. They had lots of wagons, and the wagons were all pulled by oxen because of the nature of the territory. I think that's a really good picture. It gives you an impression of what it was like traveling across country there. And there we have the oxen. Again, his sense of humor kicks in. So on convoy duty, our drivers, unless watched, used to light a roaring fire under the powder wagon. So that's a good one. So yes, they had a lot of African auxiliaries with them in the army because obviously they knew the country. So they were good scouts to have. And there's just a picture of an encampment set out. And I like this one. This is William's drawing of the postman. Now, this is quite an important matter to consider because William actually he did all these sketches and he sent them home when he could, which involved obviously going in the mail. And that, as you can imagine, took a long time because if it took a ship 5 weeks to get from South Africa to England, if you wanted to get the news back to England, how did you do it? Well, we know that William's work was used a lot by the Illustrated London News, which was one of the 3 main sources of news back in Britain. So we had the Illustrated London News, you had the English Times, the British Times newspaper, and you had the Irish Times, the 3 important papers. And as far as I know, William's sketches arrived in the offices of the Illustrated London News somehow or other. I'm still not quite sure how they got there. But the first news from Africa, once an engagement started in January 1879, the first news had arrived back in Britain in early February. So it certainly got there in far quicker time than it would have got there if the news had been sent on the boats. Anyway, I'm jumping the gun here a bit, but I just wanted you to see this because it actually says, this is an Illustrated London News sketch, and it says, from a sketch by Lieutenant W.W. Lloyd, 24th Regiment, there. So just so that we just review how communications happened in those days. So in 1844, Morse sent the first messages in America, and by 1867, the telegraph system connected America to Europe using a cable on the Atlantic Ocean. And from there, it spread across continents. And as it says here, providing the entire world with a means to communicate that required minutes rather than months to deliver a message. So I think what happened was the news was sent via Morse code and arrived fairly quickly back in Britain. As regards to sketches, well, I think they were sent verbally. As far as I can make out, the news was sent, but also Lloyd would actually send messages describing the scenes that he saw, which were then later backed up when his actual sketches arrived. Now, he wasn't an official artist, he wasn't an official correspondent, he was just a soldier, or an officer, should I say. So it's interesting, really, that he became the channel, really, of news. And here's another illustrated London News picture showing crossing of a river, which I think was based on some of Lloyd's sketches as well. And here's another. So Lloyd is good at giving us pictures of what it was like in all conditions. So here you can see the conditions. This was January the 12th. And it doesn't look too good, does it? So here's another of his humours. Different degrees of comfort, it's headed. So the man on the left, bottom left, has very little comfort because he's on sentry duty. Above him, a very fair share of comfort. That's probably Lloyd himself, I should think. On the right, the enemy, none at all. And below them, on the PK, a little comfort because they dug themselves into the hillside. And that's the cavalry camp at Dundee, one of the places they stopped on the way to where they were going to cross the border. Just to give you an idea of how good I think Lloyd was, here's a photograph of a fairly modern photograph taken of a place close to the border, and there's William Whitlock Lloyd's sketch of the same place. That's pretty accurate, really, isn't it? And it was said of him that he painted what he saw with unerring accuracy. Not a little cartoon, if you like. So whoever this is, here's an ant-heap. I'll sit down for a bit. Capital, fits my back to a T, but he didn't think about the ants. And the skirmish, so he obviously saw action. 1 pounder shelling the enemy. The skirmish on PK, and if you want to know what PK is, a small group of soldiers sent out to watch for the enemy. So they were sort of reconnaissance groups sent out to find out, because once if they were going to meet up with the Zulus, obviously they needed to find out where they were. And a bit sad, really, this one, I'm afraid, is had his day, and there's a detachment funeral. So quite poignant, as well as being also humorous pictures. Soldier's grave on the bottom there. Our best drinking water, doesn't look too good. And various people on PK duty. Shall I fire? Brown gets a snug berth under the lee of a rock, while Robinson has to make the best of it with his back to an ant heap. So let's have a closer look. You can see Zululand there on the right, Natal on the left, and you can see the border, it's in yellow there, the Tugela River and the Buffalo River. So they were headed, if they were going to, and we haven't really talked about why they were going to invade Zululand, but we will, they had to really follow the line of the Tugela River up to a point at which it would be suitable to cross over and get into Zululand. So there's our friend BARTLE-FRERE, and he was desperate to get the whole of South Africa under British rule. Something that wasn't wanted, really. Disraeli, the Prime Minister of the time, did not want this. And so really there was a clash of personalities here. Frere, whose ambition was to get a confederation of South African states, all under British rule, determined, and really going over the head of Disraeli, who said, look, we've got too few resources, we're too spread out, we really don't need a war in Zululand. But I'm afraid Frere got his way in the end. And this was the crossing point just to the west of ISANDLWANA. And that's looking across the border. And there's an actual photograph of the river that they had to cross. Once they crossed the river, they were in enemy territory. And they were in enemy territory because they had actually created a war, or they'd virtually declared war. They gave the Zulus very little choice, because they said, we need a federation of African states, but you'll have to be under us, you'll have to be under the British flag, you'll have to give up many of your customs, and you'll have to give up your arms. And that wasn't such a good thing, really. So this is an actual photograph of the Tugela River being crossed. You can see there's an aerial rope going across, so the boat's pulled across by that. And this is William's drawing of the same thing in 1879. And that's looking across to the other side. And I think this is particularly good. This gives you a really good impression of what it was like crossing that territory. And this was actually again illustrated on the news. And there's various numbers there. You can just see them faintly. And obviously there was a key, and it told you the various things that were going on. People were desperate. People back in Britain really wanted to know what was going on. And obviously the press gave them the opportunity. This is an iconic view of the British soldier looking out across enemy territory. And this became a bit of a symbol, I suppose, for the Zulu Wars amongst the British people. Again, illustrated on the news. I don't know that that is, the actual, an actual drawing made by William. But anyway, it's something that the Illustrated London News picked on. And here's another one. It reminds me a bit of the trenches in the First World War, actually. And that's one of William's drawings of the same thing, very atmospheric drawing, and another one there. So we're looking out now across ISANDLWANA Hill, across to ISANDLWANA Hill, an important point in the landscape. This is where they decided they would aim to get in order to set up camp and then find the Zulus and then obviously carry out whatever exercises they need to carry out in order to get the Zulus to submit to them. And that's one of William's drawings, which is fascinating. You see all the activity that's there, again, as they go across the landscape. Over on the right, you've got, that's cattle, I think. But on the left are the wagons and the teams going towards their destination. Now, I put this one in, and it's William himself never actually saw active service, although he was there at the time. He was involved. He was always on the edges, and so he never went to ISANDLWANA until after the engagement there. And when he got there, it was a pretty desolate scene, as you can see from this one, and particularly this one, wagon driver, ISANDLWANA. That was in July 1879. The engagements took place in January. So when they got there in July, it was a pretty poor sight that they saw. So there's the rock itself. And here's the enemy, or if you like, here's the enemy leader. So Cetshwayo, who was the Zulu king, who didn't really, I mean, he didn't want a war with the British. He was a very well-educated man, but also, of course, totally steeped in Zulu tradition, Zulu culture. And as far as he was concerned, why couldn't he just carry on living his life with his people the way he wanted to? But it was the British who came in and interfered with that. And here's the commander-in-chief, Cetshwayo, of the Zulus. And that you might think, well, that's one of William's pictures of a charging Zulu. And I told you he never saw active service, but in fact it's not, because that's one of the African auxiliaries that went across with the British forces. There were plenty of factions, a bit like Ireland really, in the medieval times, plenty of factions amongst the Irish themselves and amongst the Zulus themselves. So there were plenty who were quite happy enough to help the British invade Zululand. So he was a friend, not a foe. So let's go back a year to King William's Town, Cape Province. And this was quite an interesting photo to find. So in the middle, that's High Commissioner Sir Henry BARTLE-FRERE. And on his right hand, we're introducing a new character here. There's another West Cork man, and also a bit of a hero, Lieutenant Neville Josiah AYLMER COGHILL. Now, anyone who knows West Cork and knows the castle towns in the area will have seen the name COGHILL, a family who lived there for several generations. So these two, we call them heroes of ISANDLWANA, Melville and COGHILL. Melville on our left, COGHILL on the right. And here's just to give you a view. This is a William's, I think it's a reconstructed impression which William thought up about the actual engagement which did happen at ISANDLWANA. And as you can see there, it was actually a defeat, but not just any old defeat. It was probably the worst defeat that the British forces ever suffered, certainly in their engagements in Africa. So, and afterwards, that's burying the dead. So this is H Company, 24th Regiment. They were sent in and they were wiped out on January 22nd, 1879. And that's ISANDLWANA today. There are several war memorials dotted around there. And it was said that it's the worst defeat suffered by the British Army. So there was 400 survivors out of 1,700 troops that were involved in this particular engagement. And that included some African auxiliaries. So less than 25% survived the battle. Whereas in the Zulu force, they had a force of around 20,000 and lost perhaps 1,000, 1,500. So more like 2%. And if you go there today, you will still see this memorial to these two people we've just been looking at. So Lieutenant Tinmouth Melville, interesting name, and Neville J. Coghill, who died on this spot on the 22nd of January to save the Queen's colour of their regiment. So I need to tell you this story because it's really central to this, this particular engagement. And there it is again today. So again, there's Melville on the left, Coghill on the right. Melville wore the traditional red uniform. Coghill didn't. He wore a blue uniform. And they had a choice, in fact. They had to pay for their own uniforms so that they could wear the red or the blue. Now, some people said how foolish to wear red because, of course, everyone see you immediately. Whereas others said, well, I suppose the red soaked up the blood, so you didn't see the blood so well. And they both received the Victoria Cross after this engagement posthumously. And they were actually the first to receive it posthumously, because in its day, Victoria awarded the cross to living people who'd performed courageous deeds. But after the Zulu Wars particularly, quite a fuss was made to say that, in fact, why didn't those who died courageously also get the medals? And eventually, and this was long after the event, I think it was in 1907, in fact, the battle took place in 1879. It was agreed that these soldiers should have received the Victoria Cross, and so they did. And in fact, on this window here, you can see on the bottom, that's the Victoria Cross, which showed that, you know, that was won during this particular battle. And that's part of this window, which is in the church in Castle Townsend, which shows St. Patrick and St. George happily standing side by side there. And in that same church, there are several memorials. This is one of them. This is to Neville Coghill, who was killed in action on the 22nd of January, 1879, while saving the colours of his regiment in the Battle of ISANDLWANA, South Africa. Having crossed the Buffalo River in safety, he returned to save his wounded comrade and died with him, aged 23 years. And that's another memorial also in the same church, which also mentions the fact. And here is just an illustrated London News illustration of the story. So let's have a closer look. So the battle was fought and lost. The battalion, the regiment had lined itself up on the slopes of the hill, ISANDLWANA, and were looking for the enemy. They were looking for the Zulus. In fact, what happened was the enemy knew well enough where the soldiers were and surrounded them in one of their classic buffalo formations. In other words, two horns came round on both sides and took them by surprise early in the morning. And eventually it was a rout. And the most important thing was to not lose your colours, If you had a defeat, you retreated, but you had to take the colours with you. And these two men, Melville and Coghill, who was our West Cork man, were sent by the commander to take the colours and make sure they rode away from the battle so that the colours were saved. The colours are the flags that you see there. In fact, it was said there were two flags, the regimental flags. And so there is Melville holding the flag with Coghill on his left, trying to get away from the Zulus. But as you can see, they died trying to save the colours. So this is a pretty important picture, really, called The Last Sleep of the Brave by Alphonse de Neuville, a French artist, a French war artist. And it was painted after the event. And in fact, it's totally inaccurate. But interestingly, it became a viral sensation because the story got back home. These two men were heroes. They died saving the colours of the regiment. And there they are shown, with the colours. In fact, they didn't save the colours because the colours, as they tried to cross the river to get the colours away from the Zulu, the advancing Zulus, the colours were lost in the river. So, of course, this picture didn't really exist. But everyone had to have a copy, and it was an oleograph. It was reproduced as an oleograph within everyone's grasp, and it was sort of hung up above the mantelpiece to show the heroism of the British invading force. Anyway, so that's a picture of the artist. I thought you'd like to see the artist because he looks like an artist, doesn't he? And that's another of his pictures, a famous one, and this is Rorke's Drift. You've probably heard of Rorke's Drift. You might not have heard of ISANDLWANA, but you might have heard of Rorke's Drift because it was a battle which the Empire's forces won. And really, in some ways, that compensated for their dreadful losses at ISANDLWANA. They defended, with a small force, they defended the fortification at Rorke's Drift against the Zulus. And if you've seen the film Zulu, it's all about this battle. It's all about Rorke's Drift and not about ISANDLWANA. Now, who's this? The astute amongst you might say it's Peter O'Toole, but it's actually Lord Chelmsford, or rather it's Lord Chelmsford as pictured by Peter O'Toole, as enacted by Peter O'Toole in this Zulu Dawn, which is a film that was made after the Zulu film. And in a way it redressed the balance because it told the story of ISANDLWANA rather than the sort of totally pro-British, if you like, story that was told by Zulu. And I thought this is a good way of showing you the detail of the story, was to show you a few stills from that film. I mean, when I've given this talk before, I've actually shown an extract from the film, but I've just reduced it to a few stills so you can see how it was portrayed. So the battle is lost. The two soldiers, Melville and Coghill, are sent out with the Queen's colour. In this case, they've just shown the one flag. And they've got to escape. They've got to get across the river, because once they're across the river, they'll be out of the Zulu territory and they'll be safe, so that they have to aim for the river. And there you can see how they're surrounded by the Zulu forces. Some rather good shots leaping out, and they've got as far as the river, and there they are going down. And they have to avoid more of the Zulu warriors and go into the water. And they're going across the water, taking the flag with them. In fact, their horses are washed away from under them, and so they have to swim across. So there's Coghill getting up on the opposite bank, and then he looks back and realizes that Melville is in trouble. So he goes back to save Melville, and in so doing, the story goes, he lost his own life as well. So they're coming back out onto the bank, thinking they're safe, but in fact what they don't realize is that there are also Zulus on this side of the river who are determined to stop them getting through with the colours. And I'm afraid the inevitable happens, and the two soldiers are killed. Now, the film introduces a third character who probably wasn't there at the time, but it makes for a good story. And this character is an auxiliary, so he's not a member of the regiment, but he's supporting the regiment. He's seen what's happened. He also crossed the river, seen what's happened, and watches as the Zulus take away the colours. And he knows what a disgrace this would be if they were to take them. And looking back, he sees I'm afraid, COGHILL and Melville both are dead there. And you can see the flag in the distance disappearing. So he's keeping an eye. He watches the flag being carried up the hill. And so he decides to take aim as the Zulus are leaping across the rocks. And then, of course, you hear the shot and the flag falls down into the river. And there it is, being carried away in the river. And at the end of the film, that was really the climax of the film. So it's interesting, isn't it, that our West Cork character there should be part of that great history. The worst defeat ever inflicted on a modern army by native troops. And Benjamin Disraeli asked the question, who are these Zulus? Who are these remarkable people who defeat our generals, convert our bishops, and who on this day have put an end to a great dynasty? And in the cast of characters, you can see down the bottom there, we've got Melville, played by James Faulkner, and COGHILL, played by Christopher Casanova. I want you to remember that name. And it's actually, visually, it's a superb film. It's well worth watching if you can get hold of a copy. The titles at the end are like this. So the sun is setting over Africa, and all the while the titles are going on, these figures are moving across the screen, and they are the Zulus going back from the battle, having had a successful day, taking with them the cannons, the various paraphernalia that they've captured from the British. And it really is quite dramatic. Now, the whole incident of this heroism became part of popular culture because everyone was interested. Everyone back in Britain wanted to know what was going on. So here's a cigarette card. Now, some of you will remember cigarette cards. This is the 1950s cigarette card, which shows COGHILL and Melville trying to defend the colours there against the Zulus. And here is even a little plastic Britain's toy, again showing the colours being rescued. And this is a more recent painting, dated 2014. So it's still very much alive. And people who are interested in the history of warfare always pick out this incident, the saving of the colours, is really sort of defining this particular battle, which, as I keep saying, was one of Britain's worst defeats. Another illustrated London News version. Now, it wouldn't have been based on actual sketches from William, our friend William, our West Cork friend William, because he wasn't at the battle. He was on the sidelines. He never saw active service. But he was with the regiment. He always managed to be not in either, well, depending which way you look at it, he either wasn't in the right place at the right time, or he was in the right place at the right time. But various drawings made. Now, I showed you the colours being lost in the river. In fact, believe it or not, they were recovered later. Quite a lot later, in fact, a few weeks later. Search parties were sent out to try and find them because it was so important to get the colours back. And in fact, they were brought back. And here's an actual photograph showing the two colours, the two regimental colours. There's quite a lot of variation in the story as to whether there was one, two, whatever. There was also another suggestion, which could well have been true, that the colours were actually rolled up and put into a container. So those pictures we have of COGHILL and Melville carrying the colours with them, flying. So it may well have not happened at all. It may well be that they were just kept rolled up and they were found eventually in the river. So the Great White Queen, Queen Victoria, obviously was interested in everything that went on, and she it was who eventually would have. She actually was said that, having heard the story about Coghill and Melville, she said if they'd been alive, she would have presented them with the Victoria Cross, her award for gallantry. Obviously, they were presented with it, but not until after she had died herself. There's a drawing of it. And the actual colours still exist. And Queen Victoria presented the colours because it was so important. It's such an important engagement. She presented the colours with this wreath of immortelles, which is a way of sort of giving an extra honour, if you like, to the fact that this whole thing had happened. And this is Brecon Cathedral in Wales. This is actually where the headquarters of the present day Welsh regiment still is in Brecon. And the flag is hanging in the cathedral there. Is the regimental band in 1878. They were wiped out in the battle at ISANDLWANA. But every year, the band of the Welsh regiment gives a concert on the 22nd of January, the day when the battle was fought, to mark the Battle of ISANDLWANA. And there they are. Whether that still happens now, I don't know, because of COVID, probably not. But it was always a tradition to actually celebrate the day with a concert. And over at ISANDLWANA, also the event was commemorated. So William, having survived all this by not having to take part in any action, went back home, homeward bound. There he is, as usual, producing his sketches. And I was pleased to find this photograph. There he is on his wedding day. Married Catherine. That's William, that's our West Cork artist. And he carried on really with living in Glandore, but he liked traveling. And he produced several things. Here's one, Sketches of Indian Life, so he went off to India. And also the P&O penciling, so the Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company liked his work. And actually, I think they gave him free cruises or free journeys on the P&O line, providing he gave them various drawings, which they then had made as postcards, as souvenirs, which they gave to their passengers. So he had a pretty good few years, I think, doing that. There's several of them here. As usual, some of them have got, the one on the top right says, a perilous journey. As a cook trying to bring the food to the table. And if you look below that picture, there's a man who's suffering a bit from seasickness, I think. I won't read you out all the captions. I particularly like this one, down below, stoking the boilers. Now, sadly, William Whitelock Lloyd, I mean, he was leading this pretty good life, but he died at the age of 41. And this is the report from the Southern Star. If you like, I'll read it. Very sad intelligence from Skibbereen on Wednesday from Glandore of the reached Skibbereen on Wednesday from Glandore of the accidental death of Mr. W. Lloyd of Westview, gentleman of high social rank and position. It appears that he was in the act of dismembering a tree of some of its branches that evening when he fell a distance of 20 feet to the ground, where he was found by a manservant in unconscious condition, in which state he remained until he expired the following morning. So a rather sad end, I'm afraid. And he's buried back in Waterford, where he's brought up. So being a good researcher, I had to go along to St. Carthage's Cathedral in Lismore to look for his grave. And there it is. It's the one right in the centre there with the cross on the ground. Not in very good condition. I think, you know, it needs a bit of restoration. But as you can see, it says there, William Whitelock Lloyd, later the 24th Regiment, who died November 24th, 1897, aged 41 years. His widow moved to Castle Townsend. She had connections with the Castle Townsend families, and she died in 1924 and is buried in the graveyard of St. Barahant's Church in Castle Townsend, close to the Coghill family vault. So we get an interesting link here with the with the West Cork people who were involved in the Zulu War. So that's Catherine's grave. As you can see, it's an exact match to William's grave, but this one is in Castle Townsend. His was in Lismore. Hers is in better condition than his, I have to say. That's the inscription, and there's the vault of the Coghill family, which is virtually next door to it. So their legacy, they had 2 children, Percy and Winifred, and who still were in the castle. And this is what I've learned. Percy maintained a seedily flamboyant lifestyle and lost the family fortunes, including the castle. And we have this description. We leave Percy in the arms of a servant girl who was an inebriate and who once danced on a table in a bar, stripping off her clothes. This episode led to her catching pneumonia, from which she died. Winifred, however, didn't marry and lived with her widowed mother. So when Catherine died, Winifred inherited her father's portfolio. So she inherited all the paintings. And she was looked after in her old age by their family friends, the Beechers, Castle Townsend. So William's work passed to the Beechers. And there's Harry Beecher, later Dean of Ross in 1891. This is on the board showing the rectors of Castle Townsend, which is in St. Minihan's Church in Castle Townsend. Now we're moving forward to ISANDLWANA, but in the year 2000. And I'm showing you this for a reason. So on the left is Judith Beecher, she whose family had inherited Lloyd's pictures. And in the middle is David Rattray. And on the right is Susie Casanova. Do you remember that name? Casanova was the person who played Coghill. And I thought, oh, obviously, why shouldn't she be there? She'd be interested in it. And I did research and I could find no connection whatsoever between this Susie Casanova, believe it or not, and the actor who played Coghill. But anyway, David Rattray, he followed in his father's footsteps. His father was a great historian of the African wars. And David Rattray himself lived in ISANDLWANA, close to ISANDLWANA, in this lodge here, which he ran, called Fugitive'S Drift. It was built by his parents. He ran it as a sort of venue for people who were particularly interested in the area and particularly interested in the wars that took place in that part of Africa. And so you could book yourself a stay and you would be given lectures about the wars and taken out to see the battlefields and that sort of thing. And David Rattray produced this book. Obviously, he had an agreement with the Beecher family that he could use William Whitlock Lloyd's pictures, and they are used in this book, principally to illustrate it. Now, I think this book has been out of print for a while, but I borrowed a copy of the book, and it was obviously very useful in this research. Now, David Rattray, who I showed you, is a great war enthusiast in terms of history. And he bought a medal, which he knew came from the time, 1879. He bought it without actually seeing it. And when he got it, he found it was the medal of W.W. Lloyd. So that was a big coincidence. But he himself also died tragically in 2007 after this book was published. And he died from a raid on his land. It was a land dispute, I think, which shows that Africa at the time wasn't a stable place necessarily. So we've lost our West Cork heroes. We've lost David Rattray as well. Just before we finish, I want to take you across to Castle Haven, which many of you West Cork people will know is just along the coast to the west of Castle Townsend, and there's a very fine graveyard there, and I like this atmospheric picture of it. And you'll see this grave there, and it's to Michael Minihan, and we have a photo of Michael Minihan. Sorry, there he is. Sorry, a very poor photo, but just so you can see the man. Michael Minihan died May the 26th, 1891, late 24th Regiment, so in the same regiment, one of the gallant defenders of Rorke's Drift. We haven't really touched on Rorke's Drift because we wanted to talk about ISANDLWANA. Rorke's Drift happened just after the Battle of Isandlwana. And in fact, it was a turning point in the Zulu Wars. So it was seen as a victory, if you like, although it was a bit indecisive. So there's William's little painting of Rorke's Drift, which I thought you'd like to see. And here's Michael Minihan's medal, which sold for £84,000 in 2016, whereas 100 of Lloyd's watercolours and 24 sketches sold for £39,000 in 2012. So that's a strange sort of juxtaposition of valuations there, isn't it? So William's paintings were worth half of one medal. We don't know who bought them. We don't know where they are today, sadly. So they are virtually lost. The person who bought them didn't want his identity to be revealed, or her identity. I think it's a great shame. I think they are an amazing record. At least we have some of them illustrated in the book that David Rattray wrote, even though that's out of print. And we now have some of them recorded in this talk. William went back to Zululand, and here he is. We started off with his own self-portrait of himself in his Oxford days. And we'll finish, I think, showing a self-portrait of him working away there back in Zululand. And thanks again to Maura Cahalan, who sort of put me onto all this.
Thank you, Robert. That was a really fascinating presentation. And you know, what amazing connections, and even getting in Rorke's Drift, which is always associated with a Welsh unit, that there were Irishmen at Rorke's Drift as well. Presumably Rourke was Irish originally, whoever he was.
I think so, wouldn't it? Yes.
That's brilliant. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate your time, and we'll finish it there.